So now begins session 9, following on from Julie reading the notes Adida gave to her, which included references to myself. So I thought I would just say something briefly. I recall Julie calling me from Beloved's house, or at least from the AV cabinet, and during those weeks while she was away, I was engaged in my life back in Australia and also starting another intimacy at the time. And I think, as I probably mentioned previously, this happened many times, that Julie would come and go back and forth to Beloved during these 10 years. And I would respect completely her place with Beloved and feel Beloved's wanting and needing her with him, and would want that to happen, but also, given the nature of my personal relationship with her, it wasn't black and white. And so when she would call me from the AV cabinet, I would feel, and I believe I recall, encouraging her to stay there and to stick with the tapas and not to come back because of the pattern of coming and going. At the same time, there was a place in my heart very clearly where I was open to resuming the relationship, but I felt the seniority of her relationship to Beloved and tried to support her in staying there. But as it turns out, that didn't happen. And the part of the notes that impressed me, all the notes that Julie just read impressed me. I wasn't actually present to hear the notes at the time, and only in recent times have I heard them. But there's one line there: "No one exists in a man-woman relationship to me. It is each individual who lives as my devotee." This very much touches to the core of my particular drama with Beloved, whereby I was his devotee first and foremost, but there I was with his intimate, and it was a complex and challenging position to be in. Prior to that time, I didn't have so much of that dichotomy. It was more solely me with him. But this created a schism that was, as I said, challenging to deal with. And I did my best, but often it was beyond my pay grade, as they say.
Did you observe anything in your life at that time whereby you felt his regard?
Oh, very much so, because you were keeping connected with me and calling me with some frequency, so I was keyed into what was happening there with Beloved. And so that was informing what I was doing in terms of the measure of, was I being his devotee, was I holding him first, or was I only or primarily fulfilling my own desires and needs. And I had to acknowledge that was part of what I was doing, but given not only your voice reflecting his voice, but his voice directly reverberating in my being at that time, it was clear what I needed to do, which was to resort to him and not to follow my own desires, because they led down a path that didn't lead anywhere except continue down the path of egoic matters.
So what did you feel when you again hear him say, "To hell with Nick"?
I was pretty familiar with that language towards me from Beloved, so it wasn't a surprise.
In what sense?
Well, he'd said many things like that over the years that, I don't remember the exact words, but making it clear that what I was up to was less than great devotion and service and love and realization of him. And so he used many explicit words to make it clear to me that that's what I was doing. So no, I didn't feel rejected. I didn't feel abused, betrayed. I felt, yeah, right on, Beloved. That's plain old. That's the right description. That in the scheme of things, the devotion and realization of him was primary, and if I was an impediment to you in that, or was doing something myself that was impeding that, then to hell with Nick. That was apt.
And to add to that, my reception of him saying that is in a very real way, when he said, "This is not about Nick," and then at the same time saying, "To hell with Nick," I knew that he was also indicating that he is in relationship to you directly, and your response to him is your response and responsibility, but that I was also interfering in the way that I had been using you, and noting that in this kind of address where he instructs with the fire foot, the power foot, of the necessary criticism of the ego act, is he was indicating that this was not okay to be doing, to use you for my own separate self purposes. That was a violation and abuse of the direct vow or agreement in intimacy, divine intimacy in yoga. So to move on from these notes in particular, there is the continuing thread of this observation that he awakened more profoundly. And one of the ways that it continued was that when I would go into serving him in the sequencing room, even though I wasn't going into his most intimate domain, I was able to, as he said, stay on the periphery. So I was going over to his house and, playing the role of being a runner or bringing things into the kitchen and connecting with the ladies there, but I wasn't going into the inner sanctum, so to speak, and freely moving in and out of his space. So in the times where he was doing the sequencing, I would be there with him, and he would often say, "This is you, this is Nick," in the course of the imaging. And he said that over and over again many times, bringing the focus of attention in the context of his darshan to a greater understanding of this dramatization that he was speaking to, that takes place in mind. And there would be, again, the spectrum of images, like Adam and Eve in the garden. How beautiful, how wonderful. Adam and Eve in death. Adam and Eve destruction. The faces and the forces of the patterning that interfere with the divine light, unqualifiedly being able to descend rather than being fractured and interfered with by the ego act itself and in relationship. So this was a constant. And this went on for a good few days or whatever in time. So it was clear that Nick was entirely in his regard as this iconographic image and seriously manifest persona, that is real, just as I was in the space with Beloved, and just as he is manifest physically. And then after a period of time, I was able to come further into his intimate sphere after he had given me these notes. So there was the continuing of the completion of the suite. And there was a moment in time where he said to me, while I was standing next to him in his bathroom that's just off his bedroom, and his bathroom is large because it has a big, beautiful spa bath in these beautiful green tiles, and it's in a shower and the toilet and the bidet and the large sink and the mirror, and it's just a beautiful space, and gifts that have been given to him of traditional images and different icons from all the great tradition and things that devotees had made for him, and it being prepared. And as Adida is standing there, one of the things that devotees often were able to do as we lived with him, both men and women, we would see him live as he is. There was no part of him that was not exposed, like he was not private in that way. I mean, obviously, we didn't go into the toilet with him. And but we were there, like we would bathe with him at times, we would bathe him. It was a very intimate sphere of interaction. And so on this time when I was standing with him in front of the mirror, and one thing that I loved observing is that after he was bathed or showered and dry himself off, or we would help dry him, he would stand at his mirror in his sink, and he was so manly and a gentleman in the way that he related to everything around him in terms of caring for it, putting it in the right place, wiping out the sink, making sure that everything was related to in a sacred fashion. Everything he touched, he cared for in that way. And it was because everything was a gift to him in his sphere. And so I'm standing in front of the mirror with him, and he says, "Look at yourself in the mirror." And he's standing next to me, and I can see him and I can see me. And he's saying, "Notice that the way that you see yourself physically in the mirror is actually the reverse image of how everyone else sees you." So I stood there and I looked at that, and yes, I understood what he was saying and laughed, realizing that yes, in fact, the way I see myself in the mirror is actually the opposite of when somebody looks at me face to face in physical form. And then he also said, and again, this is another moment of a well of emotion being expressed. He said, "It is such a shame that you do not see yourself as others see you." And then he said to me, "You see yourself as damaged goods. You feel this damaged goods." So this was setting the tone relative to a false view of this persona, the narrative that I created in mind of this autobiography of the separate self persona. And then as we walked out of the bathroom, having received this profound instruction, both about the misconception of visual imagery and then also the emotion associated with it, the trauma associated with it, we walked out the door and into his bedroom, and he turned around and he said to me, "You know what the problem is with you?" And I said, "No, beloved, what is it?" Well, I mean, I did know a lot of the problems after that many years of direct intimacy, but he was going to point something else out. And he said, "You take my criticisms personally." Now, 3 sets in a very short period of time of very profound instruction, enabling me to continue to participate with him in his completion of this suite. And so I want to read a little bit more of what he describes about this suite. There is the theme of Adam and Eve. This relates to sex, specifically the bondage human beings become involved in through their egoic participation in emotional sexual relationships. However, the point is not to come up with a complete verbal explanation of this visual communication. I have already done all that verbal explaining that is necessary in the form of my literature. Visual art does not need to be explained beyond a point. If visual art is over-explained, it stops functioning in its own terms. There is no discursive verbal equivalent to the visual communication of the suite. No explanation of or in that sense. I'll read that line again. There is no discursive verbal equivalent to the visual communication of the sweet, no explanation in that sense. It is not that nothing useful can be said, but the obsessive effort to conceptualize or explain or to grasp reality is the problem with mind itself. The iconography of Eve is not about sin. It is about the mind. However, mind itself can be understood to be something like sin in the root sense of missing the mark. In the New Testament, the word translated as sin is the Greek hamartia. I think I won't read the rest of this because I can do this in the next session. So we can actually stop there.